I'm sitting in a conference room on the 32nd floor of the Willis Tower. It's a Tuesday morning in mid-June, and the Chicago skyline is laid out behind me like something from a postcard. Across the table sits Greg Sutter, my boss, the senior vice president of sales, and to his left is Dana Chen from HR. They both look uncomfortable, which, in hindsight, should have told me everything I needed to know. Greg slides a manila folder across the polished oak table. He doesn't make eye contact, just slides it across like he's distributing expense reports at a quarterly business review. Your performance bonus for the Halcourt close, he says. Not your well-deserved bonus. Not your bonus for closing the deal of the decade. Just your performance bonus for the Halcourt close. I open it. Inside is a single printed sheet. Black text. Helvetica, probably. 4 lines of information. Base salary, verified. Performance bonus, fiscal period Q2, Q3. $1,800. $1,800. Greg leans back in his chair. The leather creaks. He's got his hands folded on his stomach and he's looking at his email on his laptop. Appreciate the gesture, Declan, he says. Not appreciate the work. Not appreciate you staying on this. The gesture, like I'd done something nice for the company. Like I'd brought donuts to a morning meeting. I nod. I don't say anything. I fold the sheet of paper in half, slip it back into the envelope, and stand up. Thanks, Dana, I say to the HR rep. Greg. Then I walk out of that conference room, and I walk back to my office, and I do something that probably surprises nobody in hindsight. I quit my job. Not 2 weeks' notice, not a strongly worded resignation letter, just a clean, immediate exit at exactly 2 p.m. with my daughter's photo in my laptop bag, and no plan except to never set foot in that building again. But let me back up. Let me tell you how I got here, because the thing about moments like that, moments where you just walk away from a 6-figure salary and a corner office, is that they don't happen in a vacuum. They're the result of something much longer, something that builds and builds until you finally see it clearly and you can't unsee it. My name is Declan Marsh. I'm 38 years old. I've been in enterprise software sales for 12 years, and I'm actually pretty good at it. Not in the slick, buttonhole your target way. I'm good at it because I listen. I show up. I follow through. I don't oversell, and I don't disappear when things get difficult. The company I was working for, I'll call it TechVert because I'm not interested in burning bridges for the sake of a story, is a mid-sized enterprise software firm headquartered in Chicago. We do cloud-based supply chain optimization and logistics software. It's not sexy. It's not the kind of thing that makes you sound interesting at a dinner party, but it's the kind of software that Fortune 500 companies bet their operations on, which means the contracts are huge, the sales cycles are long, and the stakes are always personal. I was a senior director of strategic partnerships, which is a title that sounds more impressive than it actually is. What it means is that I managed large, complicated relationships with the kinds of clients who had C-suite contacts and procurement teams and quarterly business review meetings that lasted 6 hours. I was good at those meetings. I knew how to navigate them. The Halcourt Industries account landed on my desk in February of that year. Halcourt is an industrial conglomerate, manufacturing, logistics, distribution. They've got operations in 43 countries. Their annual revenue is somewhere north of $17 billion. And they had been a prospect for TechVert for almost 5 years before I got assigned to them. Let me be very clear about what that means. Every account manager we had, every senior seller, every relationship manager had already failed with this client. They'd been through our entire go-to-market strategy. They'd heard our pitch. They'd said no, multiple times. By the time the account landed on my desk, it was considered dead. Not difficult, dead. The kind of account that gets passed around like a hospital transfer because nobody wants to own the failure. But here's the thing nobody talks about in sales. Sometimes the account isn't the problem. Sometimes it's the approach. The guy I needed to reach at Halcourt was named Philip Rains. He's the chief procurement officer. Former military. Logistics background, which meant he understood supply chains better than most business school graduates. He had a reputation internally for being straightforward, extremely competent, and totally allergic to corporate politics. If you wasted his time, he'd let you know. If you were honest with him, he'd at least listen. I called his office in the second week of February. I didn't have a sponsor. I didn't have a mutual connection. I didn't have any insider advantage. I just called the main switchboard, asked to be connected to Philip Rains's office, got his assistant on the line, and told her the truth. I know TechVert hasn't been able to find a solution that works for Halcourt's scale. I've done my homework. I know you've talked to us multiple times and said no. I'd like to spend 30 minutes understanding why, instead of giving another pitch and wasting your boss's time. The honesty of it, the admission that we'd failed, the acknowledgement that another pitch was pointless probably stood out. People in sales don't usually say that. Most people call and pretend they have something new to offer. Most people oversell. His assistant called me back within 4 hours. Philip would give me 30 minutes. March 3rd, 10 a.m., in his office in Indianapolis. That call meant he was at least willing to listen. I flew to Indianapolis on March 2nd. I spent that entire evening reading not about our software, but about Halcourt, their annual reports, their SEC filings, their leadership bios. I found that Philip had spent 8 years in the Army Corps of Engineers before joining Halcourt 15 years earlier. I learned that their last supply chain modernization effort, in 2014, had been an absolute disaster. They'd partnered with a consulting firm that overpromised and underdelivered, and it had cost them millions in operational inefficiency. By the time I closed my laptop that night, I had a map of what Philip cared about, what had burned him before, and exactly where he would be skeptical. The meeting with Philip was not a sales pitch. It was a conversation. I walked into his office, a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Indianapolis business district, and Philip was exactly what his reputation suggested: composed, direct, no bullshit. We sat across from each other, and I started by asking him what he needed. He told me. I asked him what had failed before. He explained it in detail, not just the consulting firm disaster, but the organizational politics that had made it worse, the way promise after promise had been broken, the months of replanning and re-architecting while his team was left hanging. I asked him what his timeline actually was, not what he'd told other vendors. He told me the truth. They weren't in a hurry. They'd been burned before, and they were going to be careful. I told him I understood. I told him I'd come back when I had a real solution, not a theoretical one. I also told him that TechVert might be the right vendor, or we might not be. But what I was going to do was spend the time to find out, and I wouldn't waste his. He liked that. We shook hands. I flew back to Chicago, and something shifted in me. I knew at that moment that if I stayed on this account, it would become my entire professional life for a long time. And then came 14 of the longest months of my professional life. The first 4 months were research. I flew to Indianapolis every other week, sometimes 3 times a week. I met with Philip's team. I observed their operations. I watched their supply chain in action, from raw materials coming into their distribution centers to finished goods moving out to regional warehouses. I sat in their operation centers and watched the digital systems they were using, understood where they were manually tracking data, understood where they were losing time and money to coordination failures. I understood the specific bottlenecks that nobody else had bothered to actually see. I came back to Chicago and worked late into the evenings with our product team and our consulting team to map out what a solution would actually look like for them. Not just TechVert's standard implementation, but something customized to their actual operations and their specific problems. This was methodical work. The kind of work that doesn't show up on a quarterly forecast, but the kind that actually builds real deals. I was documenting everything: their current state processes, their pain points, their success metrics, the way their teams were structured. I was learning not just what they needed, but why they needed it. I was building a case that TechVert could solve their specific problem, not selling them our generic software. The solution began to take shape in my head long before it was written down anywhere. I could see it clearly, and the more I saw it, the more committed I became to making it real. This is where the first real problem started. Greg Sutter, my boss, didn't think it was a viable deal. Not because of anything related to Halcourt, because it didn't fit his quarterly number. I was spending time on something that might close in 8 months or might close in 16 months, and Greg's bonus was tied to quarterly revenue. He needed deals closed now. Deals he could forecast and close within 90 days. He started calling me into his office, asking me why I was spending so much time on that account, suggesting that I should focus on faster moving opportunities. In one particular meeting, I remember him leaning back in his chair, the same chair where he'd later hand me an $1,800 bonus sheet, and saying, "Declan, I need to see a close date. When is Halcourt closing? Not if, when." Like the timeline was the only thing he cared about, not whether we actually had a viable solution, or whether the client actually needed what we were selling. I told him I didn't have one yet. We were still in the investigative phase. I explained that pushing for a timeline would signal to Philip that we were more interested in the deal than in his actual needs. That demanding a close date was how you killed deals like this. You showed the customer that you cared more about your quota than their problem. He said, "Then we need to move on. You're a senior director. I need you closing deals, not playing consultant." I pushed back. I told him that if we did this right, this wasn't a single deal. This was a multi-year, 8-figure engagement that could set up the entire region for 3 years of recurring revenue. That the kind of patient, relationship-first approach that would win Halcourt was exactly the kind of approach that should be rewarded, not punished. He was not interested in hearing that. He was interested in Q2 numbers. His numbers. His bonus. Around month 6 of the process, so August of that year, Greg actually pulled me into his office and suggested I step away from the account. Officially, he said we needed to redeploy my time. Unofficially, what he was saying was, "This is taking too long. You're taking too long with it, and I need you on deals I can control the timeline for." I fought him on it. I told him that Philip had made clear he would only work with me, that pulling me off the account now would be the final signal to Halcourt that Techvert wasn't serious, and that would be the end of it. That it would be like investing 15 months in building a bridge and then burning it because the weather was bad in month 6. Greg didn't care. He actually sent out a memo. I found out about it secondhand from a colleague named Marcus Webb, a mid-level analyst who sat near my desk and had actually been helping me on the Halcourt work, suggesting that the deal was stalled and that the likelihood of closure within the fiscal year was minimal. Minimal. As if I hadn't already logged 23 flights to Indianapolis. As if I wasn't literally in the middle of the most detailed solution architecture we'd ever done for a prospect. As if Philip hadn't been progressively giving me more and more access to his team, which everyone in sales knows is the clearest possible signal of genuine buyer interest. Marcus came to me and told me what the memo said. We were grabbing coffee in the building's lobby. I remember we walked over to the windows and he just laid it out for me. Greg was putting ammunition into the narrative that this deal was dead. The CEO had probably already heard it. The board probably already knew. It was the kind of thing that once it gets said, once it becomes part of the corporate narrative, is incredibly difficult to undo. "He's building a case to justify pulling you off," Marcus said. He was a good guy, young, maybe 26, smart enough to see what was happening. He wants to be able to say it was a bad account, not bad management. I told Marcus that might be true, but it didn't matter. I was staying on it anyway. Greg was not going to use a memo to override a direct relationship with the client. And more importantly, if I folded now, Philip would take that as proof that Techvert didn't believe in their own people or their own solutions. But from that point forward, I was working against the clock. Not just the clock of the deal itself, but the clock of internal opinion. Greg was poisoning the narrative with leadership. The CEO was probably wondering why I was still on a dead deal. The finance team was probably questioning the travel spend. And Philip, if he found out that my own company had written me off, would rightfully conclude that Techvert wasn't fully committed. So I accelerated the timeline. I flew to Indianapolis more frequently. I started flying out on Wednesday evenings and flying back on Thursday afternoons so that I could do the work without it showing up in my travel logs as aggressively. I missed my family's summer vacation. We had a plan to go to Door County for a week in July, and I canceled 2 days before we were supposed to leave. My wife Sarah was not thrilled about that. She understood the professional stakes, but that doesn't mean she enjoyed watching me prioritize a deal over family time. The disappointment in her voice when I told her was something I carry with me. By that point, I'd logged nearly 30 flights. 30 flights in 8 months. That's more than 3 trips a month. That's pulling out of your driveway at dawn, landing in a different city, having meetings, eating bad airport food, sitting in airport terminals with fluorescent lights and no natural concept of time, and flying back late just to catch a few hours of sleep before doing it again. It was exhausting. It was also necessary. Because I knew the moment I looked like I was losing faith, the moment my own presence in Indianapolis became less frequent, Philip would take that as a signal that Techvert had pulled back, and that would be it. Around month 10, so November, the deal started actually moving. Philip's team had gone through our solution architecture. They'd asked questions. We'd answered them. And Philip called me and said he wanted to bring his CFO and his chief operations officer into a meeting to begin the formal evaluation. That call was 11 minutes long, but it felt like he was telling me that we'd turned a corner, that this wasn't theoretical anymore. That was the turning point. That's when I knew it was actually going to happen. Not maybe, not possibly, actually. But here's the thing. Even knowing that, even knowing the deal was real and moving, I was still getting resistance from Greg. We were now 8 months into this process. I had logged 32 flights. I had spent more nights in Indianapolis than I'd spent at home. I had essentially lived the Halcourt account. I'd become an expert on their business. I'd built relationships with their entire executive team, and my boss was still treating it like a distraction, like I was wasting company time and company resources on some old prospect that would never close. Like the fact that Philip was now bringing his CFO and COO into meetings didn't mean anything. In December, we had a regional leadership meeting. All the senior directors and VPs from the Midwest region gathered in a conference room. Greg was presenting the pipeline. When he got to my accounts, he said Halcourt was progressing but cautiously optimistic. In front of everyone. In front of my peers who were all hitting their quarterly numbers while I was months away from closing something massive. Cautiously optimistic is corporate speak for, I don't actually believe in this. It's the phrase you use when you want to be supportive without actually committing to anything. It plants doubt. It gives cover to anyone who wants to dismiss the deal. And it undercuts the person doing the work. After that meeting, Philip called me. He somehow had heard, through a vendor contact I think, or maybe just his network of industry people who talk, that my own sales leadership wasn't confident in the deal. He wanted to know if that was accurate. Was TechVert still committed to this, or was he wasting his time? I told him the truth. I told him that my boss had questions, but I didn't. I told him that I was absolutely committed, and that my boss's doubt didn't change anything about our ability to deliver. That what mattered was the solution and the relationship. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Declan, if your own house isn't behind you, this doesn't work. That's when I realized something. The deal wasn't going to fail because of Halcourt. It was going to fail because of TechVert, because I had a boss who didn't believe in it, a company that wasn't really willing to dedicate the resources, and a system that was fundamentally aligned against long-term relationship building, a system that punished people for thinking beyond the next quarter. But I also wasn't ready to give up. I was 13 months into this. Philip was ready to move forward. The solution was solid, so I made a decision. I was going to close this deal despite the internal resistance, not because of internal support. In January of the new year, Philip invited me to Milwaukee. He wanted to have a final meeting. Him, his CFO, his COO, and his external counsel. This was the meeting where we would either move to contract negotiation or find out that we'd spend a year getting nowhere. I flew out on a Monday. I had prepared a final presentation, but I also knew that wasn't really what this meeting was about. Philip knew what our solution could do. His team had done the technical due diligence. What this meeting was actually about was whether he believed he could trust me and my company to deliver on a $500 million commitment over 5 years. It was about whether we could be partners, not just vendors. We met at the Pfister Hotel, which is this old grand hotel in downtown Milwaukee. Historic, the kind of place that's been hosting major business deals for 100 years. We sat in a private dining room on the second floor. The room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. There was a wood table, leather chairs, and a waiter who would bring coffee without being asked. Philip's CFO asked detailed financial questions about our pricing model and our delivery costs, questions about hidden fees, implementation burn rate, all the things a CFO would care about. He was testing our transparency. His COO asked operational questions about implementation timeline, resource allocation, risk mitigation. How would we actually execute? What happened if something went wrong? What was our escalation path? These weren't adversarial questions. They were the questions of someone who wanted this to work, but needed to understand the risks. And at the end of 3 hours, after I'd answered every question directly and honestly, after I'd admitted the things I didn't know and committed to finding out, Philip stood up, shook my hand, and said, "Let's do this." We didn't have a contract yet. We had a handshake and a $500 million verbal commitment. It was the most valuable handshake of my career. That handshake in Milwaukee, February 14th, Valentine's Day, which I thought was a good omen, that was the moment the deal became real. We walked out of that hotel, and Philip said to me, "I'll have my legal team send the master service agreement by Friday. It's going to reference the architecture document we finalized in December. There might be some minor tweaks, but conceptually, this is done." I flew back to Chicago on the red-eye that night. I didn't sleep. I just sat in my seat at 35,000 feet and thought about what had just happened. 14 months, 37 flights, 1 family vacation sacrificed, constant internal doubt from my own company, and now a $500 million deal, a deal that was going to change my life. The next morning, I sent an email to Greg. I copied our CEO, Michael Chen, and the VP of Delivery, a woman named Sarah Okonkwo. The subject line was, Halcourt Industries, Deal closed. In the email, I outlined exactly what had been committed: the contract value, the 5-year term, the implementation scope, and the revenue recognition timeline. I kept it factual, professional. No, I told you so. Just deal closed. Let the facts speak. By 10 a.m., the entire company knew. By noon, we had an all-hands meeting scheduled for the following morning. The all-hands was held in our auditorium on the 31st floor. About 230 people: sales, marketing, finance, delivery, customer success, HR, everyone. Michael Chen stood on the stage. We don't actually use a podium, just a wireless mic and a lot of space. And he opened with this: "We just closed the largest deal in TechVert history. $500 million in contract value, 5 years, industrial operations client. This is the kind of deal that changes a company." And then he started talking about the process, how it had taken over a year, how it had required patience, how it had required a deep commitment to relationship building instead of transactional selling. He was making a very specific point. This win was not about the quarter. It was about long-term strategy. It was about what happens when a company trusts its people. And then he said, "I want to acknowledge the team that made this happen. Our delivery team, led by Sarah Okonkwo, who is going to oversee the implementation. Our product team, led by James Chen, no relation, who customized our solution for their scale. And the account lead, Declan Marsh, who spent over a year building the relationship that made this possible." One sentence. Declan Marsh, who spent over a year building the relationship. That was my entire acknowledgement at the company all-hands for closing a $500 million deal. But here's what I remember more vividly: what happened next. Michael paused, and then he said, "Greg Sutter, our SVP of Sales, was instrumental in supporting this pursuit. Greg, come on up here." Greg walked onto the stage. Michael put his arm around him, and Michael said, "This is what we're talking about when we talk about great sales leadership: patience, faith in our team, the ability to back a deal even when the timeline is uncertain. Greg, you've been a fantastic leader on this." The entire room stood up. 230 people gave Greg a standing ovation for backing a deal that he'd written a memo saying would never close, for patience he hadn't demonstrated, for faith he hadn't shown. I was sitting in the third row. I watched my boss accept applause for a deal I had closed against his explicit written memo suggesting it would never happen. I watched him nod humbly, place his hand over his heart, and accept the credit. I watched him become a hero in front of the entire company for something he'd actively tried to sabotage. Marcus, who was sitting next to me, leaned over and whispered, "You're going to want to leave." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because he was right. The next 6 weeks were a blur of activity. Halcourt's legal team and our legal team went through the contract negotiation. There were some back and forths on terms, but nothing that was going to derail it. I was involved in those conversations, but mostly just to answer substantive questions about implementation and delivery. The heavy lifting was being done by our legal and delivery teams. And through it all, I watched Greg show up to meetings, nod along to discussions about a deal that was now concrete and unstoppable. In that time, I was still coming to the office, still doing my job, still managing my other accounts, which had not magically disappeared just because I closed a $500 million deal. I was also dealing with the internal politics of success. People who had previously been skeptical of the deal suddenly wanted to associate themselves with it. People who had written memos about its unlikelihood were reframing their doubts as healthy skepticism. The narrative was being rewritten in real time. The deal was still unsigned. The master service agreement was on Philip's desk, pending final legal review. But everyone in the industry knew it was happening. We'd had to file notification with our board, which meant it was in our quarterly report that would be public in a few weeks. 6 weeks after that all-hands meeting, I got an email from Dana Chen in HR. "Declan, congratulations on closing Halcourt. Greg would like to meet with you on Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. for your quarterly compensation review. See you then." Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. That was the meeting where I received a $1,800 bonus for closing a $500 million deal. Let me be precise about why that number is so insulting. My base salary at that time was $185,000 a year. That means my base monthly income was about $15,400. The bonus they gave me was essentially 1.1 times my monthly base, for a deal that would generate roughly $8 million in revenue in the first year alone. A deal that would flow millions in revenue for 5 years. I understand how corporate bonuses work. I understand that there are thresholds, and there are formulas, and there are board-approved compensation structures. What I also understand is that my boss had the discretion to go higher. Greg Sutter had the authority to recommend a larger bonus. He'd mentioned a number 8 months earlier, $150,000, when I was trying to decide whether to stay on the account. He'd said it almost offhand, in an effort to keep me motivated. Keep pushing on this and you'll make it worth your while. $150. As if it were obvious. As if, of course, that's what a $500 million deal would be worth. But when it came time to actually pay that number, when it came time to back up his own encouragement with real dollars, he'd apparently decided that a $1,800 payout was appropriate. So he paid it. He handed me the envelope, he said, "Appreciate the gesture," and he went back to his email. I sat in that chair for another 15 seconds, maybe. Dana didn't say anything, just looking at her notepad, probably uncomfortable, probably wishing she was anywhere else. Greg was back to his laptop screen, already scrolling through whatever email or forecast had caught his attention before I walked in. I was holding an envelope with a piece of paper that represented a fundamental misalignment between what I had been told my work was worth and what my company actually believed it was worth. $150,000. That was the number Greg had mentioned 8 months earlier. That was the promise. That was what was supposed to happen if I closed the deal everyone said would never happen. And instead, $1,800. A bonus that barely qualified as a bonus. Less than what some of my peers made in a single commission on deals a quarter the size of Halcourt. I could feel something shifting in me as I sat there. Not anger exactly. Something colder than that. Clarity. I was seeing the company for what it actually was. A place that said one thing and did another. A place that celebrated wins publicly and minimized them privately. A place where my boss would take credit for my work and then insult me with a token payout. I closed the envelope. I stood up. I said, "Thanks, Dana, Greg," and I walked out. My mind was already moving past the moment, already asking the next question, what happens now? I didn't go back to my office immediately. I went downstairs. I went to the coffee place in the lobby of the Willis Tower, and I bought a coffee that I didn't drink. I sat on a bench near the windows, and I thought about everything that had led to that moment. The 14 months, the 37 flights, the early mornings and the red eyes, the family vacation I'd canceled, the months of constant resistance from my own company, the standing ovation for a guy who'd written a memo saying the deal would never close, the pattern of promises unfulfilled, of work unvalued, of a company that talked about supporting its people while doing the exact opposite. I thought about the moment in the coffee shop near Halcourt where I'd realized I was working against my own organization. I thought about the memo. I thought about Greg's face when Michael called him onto that stage. I thought about the way he'd accepted applause like he'd actually earned it. And I thought about Philip Raines. He'd believed in this deal when my own boss didn't. He'd trusted me even when I had to tell him that my company was skeptical. He'd seen something in me that TechVert was apparently unwilling to actually value. That was the real insight. Not that my company didn't value me. They did, in the way that a company values any tool that produces revenue. But they didn't value me as a person. They didn't value my judgment. They didn't value my commitment. They valued the outcome, and they valued it only until the next quarter began. I finished that untouched coffee, threw it away, and went back upstairs. I'd made a decision in that moment, though I didn't fully realize it yet. I was leaving. The question wasn't if, it was how. When I got back to my office, the 32nd floor overlooking Lake Michigan, I did something that probably looks dramatic when you describe it, but it didn't feel dramatic when I was doing it. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even really feeling anything. I was operating on autopilot, following a script that had already written itself. I didn't throw things. I didn't scream. I didn't even call anyone. I just opened my desk drawer and pulled out a small frame of my daughter, Maya, that I'd kept there for 6 years. Her school photo from 3 years earlier. I'd always looked at it when I was stressed, when I needed to remember what mattered. I placed it in my laptop bag, carefully, like I was packing something that couldn't be replaced. I looked around the office. The desk where I'd spent thousands of hours building relationships with clients. The chair where I'd sat through countless calls. The 2 awards on the wall for regional sales performance. The corner space with a view of Lake Michigan that I'd worked 12 years to earn. I folded my jacket over my arm. I didn't take anything else. No files, no documents, no evidence of my work. I just took my daughter's photo and I left. It was 2 p.m. exactly. I remember looking at my watch. The precision of it mattered somehow. Not 2:03, not 1:58, exactly 2 p.m. A clean exit, a clean break. I didn't leave a note. I didn't call Greg. I didn't email HR with a resignation letter explaining my departure or my disappointment or my reasoning. I didn't do any of the professional things you're supposed to do when you leave a six-figure job. I just left. I walked to the elevator. I rode down 32 floors. I walked to the parking garage, got in my car, and drove home. And I didn't go back. The Slack messages started coming in immediately. First from Marcus, then from Sarah in delivery, then from the CEO's assistant asking if I was okay, then from Greg asking where I was. I didn't respond to any of them. I drove home, and I sat in my kitchen, and I told my wife that I had quit. She didn't ask questions. "What do you need?" was all she said. I said, "Coffee. Time to think." We sat in our kitchen for 3 hours. The sun was starting to set over the neighborhood. My phone was buzzing constantly. I'd turned off notifications an hour in. Sarah made dinner. We ate together and talked about what came next. We had savings. We had options. And I had spent the last 6 months interviewing with a competitor. It wasn't quite official, but it was close. The phone call came at 4:47 p.m. the next day. I was in my home office, just a small room we'd converted. Desk and a bookshelf, windows facing the street. I'd spent most of the morning setting up my laptop, canceling subscriptions to TechVert's various platforms, and preparing documents for my exit. I'd gone through my email and downloaded everything that was mine. Notes, contacts, information I'd need for what came next. The divorce from my employer was proceeding methodically. I wasn't panicked. I wasn't second-guessing. I wasn't staring at my phone waiting for someone to call and beg me to come back. Just being methodical, making decisions that felt right, even if they felt irreversible. Acknowledging that this was actually happening. The caller ID said, "Philip Rains, Halcourt." I took a breath and answered, "Declan?" His voice was exactly what I expected. Direct, no preamble. "Hey, Philip, how are you? I'm hearing you're not at TechVert anymore." I didn't ask how he knew. Philip had an entire network of vendors and consultants, the kind of person who knows things the moment they happen. News in his industry moves at the speed of a phone call, and Philip was always first to know. Maybe someone at TechVert had mentioned it. Maybe one of the legal people working on the contract had made a comment. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd heard, and he'd called immediately. "That's right," I said. "I left yesterday." There was a silence, not uncomfortable, just Philip thinking, processing, probably running scenarios in his head, thinking about the implications for his deal. Then he said, "You understand the master service agreement is still sitting on my desk unsigned, right? We haven't countersigned yet." I hadn't actually thought about that. My resignation had been so immediate, so reactive, that I hadn't mapped out the downstream consequences. But the moment he said it, I understood what he was doing. Halcourt hadn't finalized the contract. They had every legal right to pause, and if they paused, if they said they needed to reevaluate vendor stability because the deal lead had just walked out, my former company was going to implode. "I understand," I said. "So what's your plan here, Declan?" I told him I didn't have one yet. I was interviewing with companies, and I'd know more in a few days. I asked him to give me 48 hours. He said he would. "I need you to understand something," he added. "My board is going to ask questions if you're gone. Why are we signing a massive contract with a vendor where our relationship is tied to one person, and that person just disappeared?" "I understand," I said again. "I believe you," Philip said. "But understand it from my end. I took a risk on this deal. I went to bat for you with my team. I told them to believe in you. And now, you're gone." I understood what he wasn't saying. He was disappointed, frustrated. And he was also, I thought, going to find a way to make this work. Because people like Philip don't waste investments. They optimize them. 48 hours, I said. "I'll know where I stand." "Okay," he said, and he hung up. I sat in my office for a long time after that call. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. It was a Thursday afternoon. 48 hours meant by Saturday afternoon. I needed to turn this around before the weekend, because once the weekend hit, the story of my resignation would start to spread. My former company would start damage control. Halcourt's board would start asking questions. The whole narrative would begin to shift in ways I couldn't control. I called Mark Rodriguez. I'd met Mark at a conference 3 years earlier. He's the VP of Strategic Partnerships at Northgate Systems, a direct competitor to TechVert. We'd stayed in touch through a professional but genuine relationship. About 8 weeks earlier, I'd reached out saying I was interested in opportunities. We'd had 3 interviews over 6 weeks. Good conversations, serious ones. The last was with their CEO, Catherine Walsh. and I'd gotten very positive signals. She'd asked the right questions, understood that I wasn't just a salesman, but someone who built relationships and delivered solutions. I'd been considering it seriously, but I'd wanted to see the Halcourt deal through at TechVert first. I'd told Mark that if things felt right, I'd be ready to move. I just wanted to finish what I started. Mark picked up on the second ring. "Declan, what's going on?" I told him I'd left TechVert, just walked out in the middle of the day. I said I was available to start immediately if they were ready to move forward, and that I had a critical situation requiring their answer by end of business Friday, 48 hours. Mark said, "You closed the Halcourt deal?" "Yeah." "And you're leaving TechVert?" "Yesterday, 2 o'clock. Mark was quiet, doing the math, I imagined. The deal, the departure, the implications. "I need to talk to our CEO, he said. "Can I call you back in 2 hours? He called back in 75 minutes. "You're hired, he said. "Matching your salary, $50,000 signing bonus, and you start Monday. We want to move fast, so paperwork comes by tonight." I said yes. I didn't negotiate. I didn't ask for more. I said yes because I needed the answer, and because $50,000 was more than I was going to get from TechVert, and because Northgate Systems was exactly the kind of company that could handle a client like Halcourt. Then I called Philip back, 6 p.m. "I'm starting at Northgate Systems on Monday," I said. "They're a viable partner for Halcourt. Infrastructure, product, delivery capability, they have all of it. And I know them. I know their people. I trust them." Philip said, "That's actually good. Can you set up a call between me and Northgate's leadership?" I said yes, called Mark back. Mark agreed. We'd do it tomorrow. The next morning at 10 a.m., I was on a call with Philip and his team, Mark Rodriguez and Catherine Walsh. Philip explained the situation. $500 million MSA pending signature, a specific implementation plan, and a need to understand how Northgate would support the transition without losing continuity or quality. Catherine asked smart questions. Implementation timeline? Transition period? How do we ensure continuity? Who owns delivery? Philip answered with the specificity of someone who'd already thought it through. He knew exactly what he needed. He wasn't fishing. He was testing. By the end of the call, this wasn't a problem to solve. It was an opportunity to optimize. Northgate was bigger than TechVert, with more resources. They could actually deliver on the Halcourt commitment more effectively, and they wouldn't waste energy trying to claim credit for something they hadn't earned. Philip said, "All right, here's what I'm going to do. Call my legal team, update the MSA to reference Northgate instead of TechVert, add language about implementation transition. It'll be ready for signature by Wednesday." Catherine said, "We'll execute it immediately." And just like that, the deal that TechVert had been so afraid to lose was now going to be delivered by Northgate instead. I started at Northgate on Monday. They gave me an actual office, corner space overlooking the river, not a shared desk. Introduced me to the team working on Halcourt. They'd already hired a senior implementation manager specifically for this engagement. They had a plan. They'd taken me seriously. Tuesday morning, my second day at Northgate, Philip called. "I'm sending the updated MSA to Catherine for signature this afternoon," he said. "Where do you want your commission check sent?" "Commission?" I said. "For closing the deal," he said. "Northgate is the vendor now. You closed this for Northgate, so Northgate's commission structure applies." I called Mark immediately. "Is there a commission pool for this?" Mark said, "Yes, Northgate's standard is 2% of contract value for strategic partnerships. $500 million at 2% is $10 million. Your territory created this deal, so it flows to you." $10 million. Let me say that again. $10 million. Not in the first year. It would be spread across the 5-year term. But on paper, on Northgate's books, I'd just generated a $10 million commission pool. TechVert's compensation structure would have paid me something, sure. Maybe another $20,000, $30,000 if they'd been generous. But Northgate's structure, the structure of a company that actually understood the value of relationship-driven sales, was allocating $10 million to this single transaction. Within 6 hours, the news spread. Halcourt's legal team was working with Northgate, not TechVert. The MSA was being re-executed. The entire relationship had shifted. I found out later, through Marcus Webb, still at TechVert and texting updates, that the moment Greg found out, he went straight to the CEO. Michael Chen called an emergency all-hands meeting. Greg apparently said, "We have a catastrophic situation," and outlined what happened. The deal had migrated. I had taken it with me. The entire Halcourt relationship was now Northgate's. The board was apparently furious. Michael had been the one who'd given Greg credit for supporting the deal. Michael had been the one who'd framed it as a sales leadership win. And now the person Michael had publicly praised for his leadership had lost the deal because he'd managed his people so poorly that his own senior director quit and took the client with him. Marcus also told me that Greg had tried to call Philip, tried to convince Halcourt to stay with TechVert, tried to argue that relationship continuity meant staying with the original vendor. Philip didn't take the call. By end of Tuesday, it was done. Northgate had signed the MSA. Halcourt had signed. The deal TechVert had been terrified of losing was officially, legally, contractually, a Northgate engagement. The commission was real. Revenue would flow to Northgate instead, and the relationship I'd spent 14 months building would be executed through my new company. That was 2.5 years ago. I've been at Northgate since. The Halcourt deal has been exactly as valuable as expected. More, actually, because Northgate's implementation is more efficient than TechVert's would have been. It runs like clockwork. We've already had 2 contract renewals with expanded scope. We're looking at another $50 million in additional value over the next 18 months. Philip calls me every month to talk about optimization and expansion. The relationship didn't end when I walked out of TechVert. It got better, stronger, real. My commission closed at $9.2 million after contract adjustments. Real money, life-changing money. Not for bragging rights, but for security. I took $6 million and paid off my house. No mortgage. 30 years of payments eliminated. I bought my wife a car she'd wanted for 5 years. A Range Rover. Nothing fancy. Just something she'd mentioned every time we walked past a dealership. I funded my daughter's college in full. 4 years at whatever school she gets into. No student loans. No financial stress. The rest is in investments. Not because I need to be rich, but because I wanted to build something that wouldn't disappear. Something that would still be there for my family, even if everything else fell apart. Greg Sutter is still the SVP of sales at TechVert. I checked a few months ago. I'm not bitter. I'm not wishing him anything bad. But I'm grateful I got to see clearly what happens when you prioritize quarterly numbers over people, and when you claim credit for wins you didn't create. Philip still calls every month. We meet at least quarterly. He's the straightest shooter I've met in this industry, and he's become a real friend, not just a client. We have lunch, talk about his business and mine, the industry, life. Someone I actually want to know, not someone I'm trying to sell or manage. He once told me, "I always know who I'm working with. I pay attention to who does the work, not who takes the credit." That was a compliment about me. I tried to take it as a lesson for how to live, because that's what it was. Telling me that visibility, character, and doing actual work matters more than titles, announcements, and credit. He was showing me what I'd been missing at TechVert. The thing about walking out at 2 p.m. isn't about that moment. It's not about anger or principle or the insult of $1,800. It's about seeing something so clearly you can't unsee it. I saw that my boss didn't value me, that my company wasn't willing to back its people even when they generated transformational revenue. That the system was designed to extract value from people like me and give credit to people like Greg. That the organization had shown me exactly who they were, and I finally believed them. So I left. And I left in a way that created consequences. Not maliciously. I didn't sabotage anything or burn bridges with Philip or try to manipulate him. I just stopped playing the game, made a clean break, and pivoted immediately to what was next. The moment I did, the moment I showed Philip I was serious, that I wasn't coming back, that there was a viable alternative, everything changed. The deal stuck with TechVert suddenly found a home at Northgate. The fragile relationship became solid. The narrative my company had been building, that I was just a single point of failure, got rewritten by facts. That's the real lesson. Not be aggressive or demand what you're worth or always have leverage. The lesson is simpler. When you see clearly that someone isn't operating in good faith, you don't have to convince them to change. You don't have to confront them or demand more or make threats. You just have to be willing to leave. And sometimes, the leaving itself becomes the most powerful thing you can do.